Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for tuning in to the YP podcast once again. I am delighted to welcome you here and to introduce my co-host, Chelsea Shapiro, who is a local real estate broker. She also has a background working for her family's architecture firm and is a member of the YP Advisory Board. I am Marissa Gaston. I am the director of the WPC Young Professionals. And today on our podcast, we have as a guest Representative Andrew Barkis from Washington's 2nd Legislative District, who is also an expert in the legislature on affordable housing. And we are thrilled to have him here. And I will hand it over to Chelsea to get the discussion on housing rolling.
Thanks, Marissa. So the whole housing conversation, it's a huge topic. We're going to try and cram a lot in today. And the focus really is on the impact of COVID and specifically the eviction moratorium and what that has looked like in the state of Washington. And we're breaking this down into the who, what, and why. So it's kind of just what you need to know about this topic and what it's doing in the state of Washington and how it's impacting everybody. So to start off with the who of the housing industry and of the eviction moratorium. So landlords and tenants are the key players that we're going to be talking about mostly today. There are property managers, brokers, builders, a lot of other occupations and industries that overlap, and we might mention that, but the bulk of the conversation will be on landlords and tenants and that symbiotic relationship they have. So Representative Barkis, could you describe the key players in housing and who they are and what drives them?
Sure. Thanks, Chelsea, and thanks for the opportunity to talk to you and Marissa today on this important topic. So you did a great job. I mean, it's the word symbiotic. I've been using that a lot. The environment, it's not just one particular entity. Although it seems like it, because the narrative over the last several years has been very heavily weighted towards the tenant side of the equation, with tenant protections and regulatory. But you have the two main. Obviously, you have those who live in homes and apartments, and those who provide those homes, the housing providers, and then you have a myriad of different styles of housing. So you have small, a single family. You have residential, apartment complexes, duplexes. Just a whole bunch of different types of housing elements. The other players that are involved, of course, are the various stakeholder groups or the activist groups. So you have, on one side, you have a very active tenant organization, primarily spearheaded by the Washington Low Income Housing Alliance. There's also the Community Action Network, CAN as it's known. And then on the housing providers, you have the multifamily, the Washington Multifamily Association, you have Rental Housing Association, the Washington Rental Association. And again, you're dealing with the different segments of types of housing elements. So obviously the multifamily deals with the big multifamily apartment complexes and such. So it's challenging because for one, and the job I've had to do and what we've been doing over the last several years is bringing that housing coalition together. So the housing providers, all representing different interests and types of housing, bringing them together to find out, how policy will affect them, and then trying to get a unified or a consensus on policy decisions, how that is. On the tenant side, they're pretty focused singularly on just additional protections. It's all been about that. Source of income, eviction reform, and most recently this session, just cause. And again, these are all major policies that affect the ability for us to be able to provide housing. Add on top of that, COVID and a little thing called the eviction moratorium, which we can discuss. And it has been a very complicated arena. Literally spent hours last night trying to put some final touches on amendments to deal with a bill that will purportedly end the moratorium and give us what we've been talking about as an off-ramp to it.
Okay. And I think it'd be nice to also break down, so I mean, you called them housing providers, landlords is a common term. Maybe we can unpack that a little bit more, because I mean, you've got your mom and pop landlords, just people who maybe don't have a lot of rentals, maybe it's their side hustle or their retirement plan. And then you've got major corporations who own large numbers of housing units. Can you maybe describe a little bit what a landlord looks like and who is involved, which types of landlords are involved and how they're involved?
Well, yeah, you did a good job. You've nailed them. And again, I'll just point back that is one of the challenges. Okay, so multifamily. Multifamily can be 4 units, 10 units, 400 units, 1,000 units. It can be massive corporations that own thousands and thousands of units. It can be an individual owner who has one little apartment complex that has 10 units in it. I would say the bulk, when you start to break down, are what I call, excuse me, the 1 to 4s, right? These are folks who have decided to get into what is one of the best ways to invest and to create wealth and to create opportunity and retirement, et cetera, is investing in real estate. Whether it's your primary residential home that you live in, right? We talk about home ownership and the value of home ownership and how that has been proven to lift people out of poverty and give them, equity, et cetera, et cetera. But you have people who have the means or ability to buy additional rental units, investment properties. That could be a single home, it could be a duplex, fourplex, et cetera. And then you have the full spectrum. So you have every ethnic group, you have every minority, all the different spectrum of people who have seen this as an opportunity. And so, our concern is, of course, is the impact on those various ones. One of the biggest areas we've seen the impact is on the person who has 1 or 2 units, right? And maybe this is their retirement plan. Maybe they've purchased these homes and they paid them off, and the rent that they're receiving is actually what they live on as part of the retirement. So it's a very fragile system, right? And you have to have reserves, et cetera. Then you have those who maybe are buying them and starting to plan for the future. They're a little younger. They still have mortgages on them and et cetera. And they have to use the rent received to be able to pay those mortgages along with the taxes and upkeep, et cetera. And there's a lot more to it. It would take a lot longer to talk about, but that's kind of the essence of it. So when we're considering policy, especially like the eviction moratorium, you can see how it affects the various entities differently. And there are some misnomers, right? The misnomers are, these big corporations can handle the loss. They can write off the loss. They have more margins. It's just not accurate. It may be for some, but I would tell you for a lot of others, especially if they're new and they're investment groups or whatever else, they have responsibilities to those investors. They have mortgages and they have a very small margin for the return. And so when you start having mass vacancies or loss of rent or delinquencies, it obviously affects the balance sheet and the ability to pay and do what you have to do. Now imagine if you're a small landlord who has a couple homes and maybe 3 of those homes, 2 of them, the people are not paying rent due to this moratorium, and you have to backfill that, and you don't have the resources. So maybe you're now dipping into your retirement. Maybe now you're taking out loans. Maybe you're having to do all this other stuff. Or worst case scenario, you're losing the home. You face a potential foreclosure. Or the other thing that we're seeing happening broadly, especially in the single family arena this year, people are selling. People are making the decision to reinvest in another mechanism and saying that this is too risky. And so they're selling their asset.
Right. So that right there is one of the only ways around the eviction moratorium. If you have a tenant who is not paying rent, you can't evict them per the governor's moratorium, but you could sell. So yeah, I'm seeing a lot of that as well. Yeah.
We had as most and maybe your listeners know, I've been actually in the business for 30 years. I've managed every type of property. I have a company now that specializes in single family homes. We're a sizable portfolio, used to be. It's dwindling because we set a record this month in notices given to sell. So when we contact our owners and let them know an update, and we had to just contact them again and tell them sorry, it's been extended till the end of June. I can still not do A, B, and C. Oh, by the way, your lease is coming up in July. Would you like to renew, or would you? And overwhelmingly, they're like, no, we're going to start the sales process. And then there's a whole bunch of hoops you have to jump through there too. Mm-hmm. With the affidavit and 6 days notice, and then and then we've also had a few who have refused to leave even after that process has been done. They're like, we have nowhere to go, and it's really difficult to try to get them out.
Yeah. So building on that and starting to really drill into the kind of what portion of this discussion, what are the issues and the problem? Could you speak more to how the issue of housing during COVID and the response to it has changed and evolved, kind of the timeline, especially in regards to the eviction moratorium?
Sure. So it's complicated because we have a housing crisis in the state of Washington. We have a housing crisis in our nation. And it can be very much boiled down to supply. The most recent numbers show the state of Washington somewhere around 150,000 units of shortfall to meet the demand, current and future growth. We have set in motion policies and legislation and Growth Management Act, et cetera, that have created the problem, in my opinion, in many's opinion, that have created this issue of lack of supply. That lack of supply, prior to COVID, you saw the result of that because we have had the lowest vacancy rates we've ever seen. And as a result, some of the highest rents and rent increases, because when you have low supply and high demand, that's how the market works. Enter COVID. Right after session last year, almost a year to the date, we were summoned, my colleagues and I, by the governor to say, hey, this is coming. The governor just put in his emergency proclamation. We thought, okay, he's going to do this for 30 days or 60 days. Little did we know that we'd been still in a state of emergency a year later. But also, he said that he was looking at, based on the federal stuff and what other states were doing, an eviction moratorium. And so we all got together and we sat down and we said, okay, here's what this looks like. And the problem statement was, how do we keep people from losing their homes who are going to be out of work and affected by COVID and will not be able to pay their rent? And a moratorium, by its very nature, is something that pauses an action for a short period of time. The pause then allows the policymakers and whoever's involved to come up with a plan. And that's exactly what we did. So we immediately got on it. We started working together. We sent a ton of information to the Department of Commerce, to the governor's office, and said, okay, we're in support of you pausing things for 30 days, the first moratorium. Here's all the information. And we came back and said, the number one thing that we have to do is find resources, being rental assistance, and build a fund and a mechanism, which we already have in Commerce. We already had set that up via what we call the Landlord Mitigation Fund, so that people could access resources when they needed it, while they were waiting for unemployment, while they were waiting for all this stuff to shake out, which we didn't know, right? We didn't know we were going to be, stay home for 2 months. We didn't know all the other stuff. The sad thing is that we did all that work only to have them come back and extend the moratorium for a long period of time and then double down on the terms of it. So no longer were we just doing a moratorium about rent. Now we were prohibiting business practices. No rent increases, no late fees, no compliance, no threats, no notices, no. We went, wait a minute, where the heck did this come from? We now can't do our job. And as it started to roll forward, it just got worse. And so the longer the moratorium is in place, and in my opinion, and many others, the moratorium has done more damage in the entirety of the system than it has good. The good it's done is, of course, preventing people from being evicted. But you also have those who have just refused to pay. You've had all sorts of other things, compliance issues, all these other things that have been nightmares. And I have massive documentation on this. So then the governor reconvened a stakeholder group, I think it was about October. We've been calling for a special session. My colleagues called for a special session and said, look, why don't we just use the rainy day fund, the budget stabilization account, dump $400 million in an account and start getting rental assistance out? And there was like, well, we're waiting for the federal dollars. We might have some. And as you know, we did get some, and he kind of piecemealed out 50 million here and another 35 million here and whatever. Not enough. And then that whole moratorium work group worked for 2 months pre-legislation to come up with a plan. And then he extended it again. So that's been the process and the frustration. And so once we arrived at in session this year, immediately went to work on legislation to create a roadmap to do that. And that's what I've done, and that's what others have done. And unfortunately, my plan has not been accepted. There's a different version, and that's what we're working off of right now to try to make it better. And the funny thing is that in the context of this bill that's coming forward, it does establish the rental relief program, it established all this other stuff, but it took pieces of that proclamation and put them into policy, right? Tenant protection and policy. And one of the sticking points that we're still trying to do, it does not provide a definitive end to the moratorium. So you can hear my frustration, right? Because I think landlords and tenants need to know that both they have these resources and that this is going to end.
Yeah, markets in the real estate market, it's essential to have stability and to have certainty. It's hard enough to predict how the market's going to go up and down, but you need to know what constraints and laws you're working with. And I think that's absolutely the frustration. I hear it every day with my clients, where there's some of them who haven't been able to collect rent for 6 months, 10 months. And oftentimes those tenants still have their job. They're capable of paying. They're just opting not to. So, and
I'll tell you, Chelsea, one of the most frustrating things that we heard in testimony when we brought forth these bills, that what you just said and what so many have said, and it's documented. I have literal, real-time data I can provide right now. And we were told that's a myth. It's a myth. That's what the Washington Low-Income Housing Alliance and their lobbyists said in testimony. There was a myth. And we needed to dispel this myth that people would elect not to pay. And we're going, this is crazy. I mean, we've had 2 rounds of stimulus. We've had more unemployment than we've ever seen. I have people who own businesses now that are opening back up. They can't find people to go to work. They're texting me and saying, "Hey, do you know anybody that will come to my restaurant work? I'm struggling because I can't get anybody to come back to work. They're getting too much money on unemployment." And then you have others, and we have documented proof of people who, they absolutely could pay. And then we structure everything within the fund. We structure everything at a really low AMI. We structure everything around the segment that says, "Oh, these are the people most hurting." And we're going, wait a minute. If you narrow it down that much, then there's a whole segment that's not going to get that relief. There's a lot of people out there legitimately who have never lost their job in their life, who have never been on unemployment in their life, who have never missed a payment, who are struggling and trying to figure out how to do this. Those are the guys that we need to get some funding to help them out. That's the safety net. That's what government, one of the roles of government that we should do.
Yeah, well, I think this actually segues really nicely into the why, which is the why behind this. And there seems like there are some ideologies that are combating each other right now. And even, just the government's stance that, well, people will pay rent even if they're not mandated to, and just assuming the good intention of everybody across the board. I mean, there's a lot of ideologies at work here, but maybe you could discuss some of the ideologies that inform the different approaches to the issue of housing.
Well, again, I think you're spot on with your assumptions. I mean, I think more so than the ideology, there is this contention that it's very much become us versus them, right? It's very much become landlord versus tenant, or i.e. tenant versus landlord, that landlords are out to get tenants, and they don't care about people, and they don't care about tenants, and the tenants on a whole are abused and taken advantage of, and they need all these protections. And so you get that conflict situation. And I called it out in a hearing one day. I just said, I don't understand this. If you look at it from a totality, landlords can't exist. We talked about this at the beginning of the show. There is that nexus, right? Symbiotic relationship. You cannot have a housing provider without a tenant. And it behooves the housing provider to provide a great, safe, clean, affordable piece of property to rent. And it behooves the tenant to be a good tenant and abide by the lease terms, because after all, they're contractually leasing somebody's private property, right? So we can't forget about private property rights here, which we have. And in that manner, they're, it behooves a tenant to be good, pay the rent, take care of the place. And that's the typical relationship, right? That's probably 80%, 90%. I don't know. But I imagine. And then you have those who abuse the system. And you have those who are not good tenants. And you have those who are not good owners, right? And those are the ones that you have to, as we work on the industry, have to do that. But those ideologies about the tenant, right? The protections and this that tenants inherently are being abused has crept in over the last couple of years. And it's been led by Seattle in Washington State, Seattle and King County, primarily Seattle, as we've seen in every other policy that's affected Seattle, right? And we've seen the outcomes of those policies in a once glorious city that is now a shell of its former self. You've seen those policies being enacted, and what happens in Seattle typically ends up in Olympia. And I've been in Olympia now, in my legislative capacity for 5 years, and I've watched it. And those before me saw it coming earlier, right? Because it's been at least the last 10 plus years. And this ideology comes in, this progressive move, this tenant-centric, starts in Seattle and comes down, and it maybe peppers into King County, Federal Way, Burien, kind of doing their own thing. All based on this false nomer that tenants need more protections because landlords are doing X, Y, and Z. Okay. Source of income a couple of years ago. Landlords are not renting to people because they're not considering their sources of income. Well, why wouldn't they consider sources of income? Well, it was about housing and housing authorities. Well, there's a whole bunch of stuff that goes on with housing authorities. And we forget that there's a lot of risk when you're renting to certain segments of the population. And those risks weren't being done. So we did that. Eviction reform 2 years ago. We ran bills. I ran bills. We they wanted to change it. We changed the process from a 3-day notice to 14-day notice, and we added in all sorts of components in there that makes it very difficult to evict somebody, right? Just cause, which has been in existence in Seattle and King County for years, which gives a litany of things you have to do, causes that you have to come up in order to go through this process to be able to remove somebody from your property. Okay, so that's been the onslaught from the housing providers. We unfortunately, we've been somewhat proactive in trying to propose alternatives, but it's very difficult. One, when you're in the minority, that's the bottom line. But two, when you have this huge push from the majority, and it's in every single aspect, right? And they have the wherewithal and the means and the narrative, and especially now the narrative, to be able to further this. And so this year, when they came in and said, well, we need just cause, there were 8 different policies, 8 different pieces of legislation around landlord tenant law again this year. And I said, pause this stuff. What the heck are we doing? Why aren't we just dealing with the COVID crisis and rental relief and dealing with the problem at hand? Why are we doing additional reforms and regulations within that space that's only going to make it harder for those providing the housing? And their answer, it's needed. And their answer is, when you present all the other arguments and everything else, they're not very willing to listen to a counter argument or have a discussion about, because their answer, just like I said, it's a myth. It doesn't exist, or this does exist, or this is happening. What are you talking about? Tenants, landlords are all bad, and I'll say one last thing. They said their big thing about this ending the eviction moratorium, they said that as soon as the eviction moratorium ends, landlords are going to evict everybody. And there's going to be this a tsunami, this flood against the courts and everything else. And I'm like, what in the heck are you guys talking about? First of all, if the eviction moratorium ended today and I wanted to start a process to evict somebody legitimately through the law and the courts, it would take me at a very bare minimum 60 days. And with the courts the way they are, probably adding another 60 days on top of that. That's 4 more months. So worst case scenario, somebody's going to be able to stay in that house for another 4 months while they sort it all out. And at the end of the day, when that eviction finally comes, they can leave right at the end after you spend all the money and all the time and everything else. And they can avoid that whole process by everything else we've created, because all they had to do is get the resources to take care of it. That's a lot. I know. Sorry.
You're preaching to the choir here. I'm a landlord as well, and it's insulting just that they equate landlords with slumlords, and it's just such a us versus them and kind of victim mentality, and it drives me nuts too. And
now we spent hours and hours and hours listening to testimony, and here's the other thing I said, and this was kind of interesting. I said, if your groups, right, all these activist groups, if you worked to train tenants to be great tenants, and you worked to spread that to owners, to help the owners who are not the best owners, and you actually worked to develop a relationship and communicate and educate, right? As opposed to training tenants to be activists. Because the tenants and the people who were on these testimonies, go back and look at them. Watch the testimony. They're reading prepared scripts. They're prepared by these groups on how to speak about how bad the landlord is. They're going to be homeless. They're going to be kicked out. They fear for their lives. They fear for their safety. They fear for their mental health has been messed up. All of them are on the same talking points. And you can call it out. And I called them out. I said, what I'm hearing here today, I'm sorry if this is actually happening, it's an isolated situation, but why aren't you, as a group that professes to want to help tenants, why aren't you helping them? Why aren't you actually helping them navigate or get resources or deal with their problems? Or if there's an owner issue or a maintenance issue, why aren't you working in that manner as opposed to creating the us versus them mentality?
Yeah. It's a very zero-sum approach. And this, we said at the beginning, we said it again, it's a symbiotic relationship, and it should be a win-win scenario. So both groups should walk away winning, and that is totally possible. But when you approach it from a zero-sum stance and you create victims, you really don't get a lot of productivity done.
Yep.
And Representative Barkis, just to kind of start wrapping up here as kind of a last question for you, given everything that we've discussed, what would you say the future of housing looks like in Washington State over the next 10 to 20 years in terms of availability and affordability?
It's a little bleak. I'm an optimistic person. I want to be optimistic. I want to work, but I also am a realist, and I've learned a lot in my role as a legislator. Legislating is very different than business. In business, we make a decision, we find a pathway to take that idea to implementation, and it's challenging, but we do it and we find a way to do it. In legislation, it takes years. I'm working on a piece right now on GMA reform that's been 3 years that we've been working on, and it does very minor changes, right? And we've seen some changes within the Growth Management Act that would help with affordability. I had a bill, I've been working on a bipartisan bill about accessory dwelling units, ADUs. Can't get it across the line, can't get people to accept it because every single entity has their problem with it. And the longer we have a problem with it, the less of these that we're building, which are a perfect gateway into more housing stock, right? And affordable housing stock. So I think much needs to be done. We need a lot of reforms. We need to look at incentives. I've done presentations, I've worked up various things. I said, we need to lower the cost of building 20 to 25%. And of course, that's not even taking into consideration market situations. Right now, we have a huge lumber crisis, right? Lumber has skyrocketed, but we're also adding more regulation this session alone on how houses are being built or apartments being built. When we start to put in green energy guidance that says you have to do X, Y, and Z, when we start to say you no longer can use natural gas, contemplated, when we start to say you have to have, let's say fire suppression in everything, not opposed to fire suppression, but you have to know that's very expensive to do that. All those things add to the cost of housing. So the future is, there's a lot of talk, there's a lot of planning, there's a lot of, engineering, I guess you would say that, we saw that, well, we're just going to build mass units downtown Seattle and everybody's going to live downtown Seattle. How's that working for you? You know, I mean, how many housing units were built in downtown Seattle, and then the pandemic hits and everything shifts and people don't want to be downtown. And so you've had 15, or I don't know what the stat was, 15,000 people move out of downtown Seattle. So guess what? Housing's pretty cheap downtown Seattle. You can get pretty good deals on housing. I think it's gone down 12 or 15%, rents have, in the last year. Mm-hmm. These are shifts that people sometimes take into consideration, but others don't take into consideration. So overall for the state of Washington, I think we are a long way off to meeting the goal of that shortfall that I said in the beginning of about 120, 150,000 units. And if we don't take steps today and we don't do both things, that is only going to increase. That number is only going to increase, and it's only going to be worse. I haven't seen a year in my business where I've had less than a 1% vacancy. I haven't seen massive units coming online. They're building apartment complexes here, and they're full. They build them, they're full. And they're expensive. They're very expensive. And lastly, we're not going to solve the housing crisis in Washington state with government plans and building government housing and building affordable housing. There is a role for affordable housing built through the government. There is a role for that, but it should be only a portion thereof. It should not be the solution. Pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into our Commerce Housing Fund to build very, very, very expensive, quote unquote, affordable housing is not the right way to do that. I would love to see some of those dollars be put into incentives for the private sector to hedge against some of those costs and figure out ways that we can partner, public, private, private, public, any way we can do that to encourage more building. But I was just talking to a friend of mine here in Olympia who's working on a project downtown on the waterfront. A big company just came in. They're willing to invest tens of millions of dollars on a brownfield site that had been vacant, fallow for 20 years. They're planning to spend $15 to $20 million just to get the site cleaned up, ready to build on. And guess what? The city, in their infinite wisdom, is fighting against that. People are fighting against that. And you'll probably have a situation where this person will say, you know what? If I don't have certainty, I'm not going to invest. I'll take that money somewhere else. I'll take it to another state and do that project somewhere else. And I've heard story after story of investors and people coming in this area that have done just that because they go, you know what, it's just too risky to build here. It's too expensive.
Mm-hmm. Well, Representative Barkis and Chelsea, my co-host, thank you so much for this fantastic discussion on housing policy in the state of Washington. A little bit of a bleak note to end on, but hopefully our listeners will come away from this with more ideas about.
I don't want to be a bummer. Yeah, I don't want to end on a bleak note. I appreciate you guys. I appreciate the discussion. And just know there's a lot of good people working really hard. And there's a lot of people who are trying to solve these problems and are going to continue to work to solve these problems within the current reality and political climate here in Washington state.
Absolutely. And hopefully, as we've previously discussed, that symbiotic relationship between landlords and tenants at the core and moving forward from there can really be appreciated, and our policy can take that fully into account. So to our listeners, thank you so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed talking about housing and housing policy, on March 31st, YP is hosting a free virtual statewide panel of experts to talk about housing and homelessness, 4-person panel, 6 p.m. On Wednesday, the 31st. I encourage you all to sign up, tune in, and join us. We also have our April 8th book club coming up. We will be reading The Millionaire Next Door. Please join us for community and discussion about that. And we have our climate change debate, which will be hosted by the Gonzaga YPs on Tuesday, April 20th. So lots of great stuff coming up in the YP program. Thank you so much again to Representative Barkis and Chelsea. Thank you both. Thank you to our listeners, and we will catch you next month.